Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host and producer. My name is James Fergoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from Pro Football Network. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, if you find yourself in times where you're typing on a keyboard has gotten you in trouble, can you really tweet yourself out of the situation? Has that been shown to work?
So tweeting through it is never a method of getting out. Tweeting through it is simply an emotional catharsis. It's a way for you to navigate your own feelings on the mistakes you have just made as you have continued to tweet. It very often results in more mistakes, but tweeting through it is more of a catharsis. You can't tweet yourself out of a situation you tweeted yourself into, right? It's like the tools of the master cannot, or the tools of the master cannot, what was the bell hook's line? Dismantle the house.
And it hurts because they really want things to be better, but they are not physically capable of it.
Yeah, I mean, you really need to rise to the occasion. And if you don't have that capacity, if you can't really, get up and do it, then it's going to be so difficult for you to accomplish your task, finish your goal, really leave everyone satisfied with what you're trying to accomplish.
So again, that's a lot of salmon-colored suits right there. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well. We just put out our April Fool's Day episode a couple of weeks ago. About a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, maybe? Sure.
Sure. Whatever April
today.
Fool's was.
Yeah, actually, by the time most of you are listening to it, it'll be a week ago. Great. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun for us to do. That was a lot of clip stuff that we put up on Patreon, and then some of our fake ad reads, which is becoming a favorite part of the year for me now. It's not quite up there with the draft and the opening up of the floodgates for people applying to be parts of like the Hell League or the regular fantasy league and all that, but it's like right up there in my top 5 favorite moments of the year now. Is writing some of these is a lot of fun. And if you missed it, check it out. It's really good. We make a big deal about not running ads all the time, and then we get to do one episode a year where we get to do our fake ad reads, and they're great. And I think the two best ones are probably BetterHelp and Arif doing was it DraftKings? I want to say it was a DraftKings ad.
Yeah, it's DraftKings.
Yeah, the DraftKings ad is spectacular, and there's like layers to it, so it's absolutely something you should check out. It's the episode on your podcast feeder that's before this one. So, and again, if you enjoy it, you can do what I'm about to tell you, which is you can support us financially a couple of different ways. You can go over to patreon.com/NorseCode. There's a segue. Patreon.com/NorseCode. You get access to bonus materials. You get access to Discord. You get access to all sorts of stuff over at patreon.com/NorseCode. A couple of people we want to thank for signing up over on Patreon. Want to thank Kevin D. Ukura. Sure. Sorry. Kevin, thank you so much. Timothy Moe, thank you. Andreas Vega, thank you so much for signing up. And then Bask over on the Lockdown site, who apparently signed up specifically because of the BetterHelp ad.
Fantastic.
This was a quality episode you all should listen to. So thank you, Bask. Really do appreciate it. Again, patreon.com/NorseCode is the best way to support us. It ends up giving us access to things like being able to do the live shows and all of that. So again, thank you. You can also do paypal.me/NorseCode as well if you're interested. Or you can go over to norsecode.threadless.com and buy a baby onesie, because the babies are being born, apparently. We'll talk about that later. There's baby onesies, there's t-shirts, there's coffee tumblers, and of course, the mythical shower curtain. But you can check that out over at norsecode.threadless.com. All right, it is a draft, but kind of a draft spectacular. We've got two guests lined up here, so what we're going to do is we have two interviews that Arif conducted earlier today. First with Thor Nystrom, draft analyst for Fantasy Pros. And then we have Corey Kinnan from Daft on Draft and Brownswire. We're going to go to an interview that Arif conducted earlier today with Thor Nystrom.
All right, I'm here with Thor Nystrom of the draft analyst over at Fantasy Pros, if I think I got that correctly. Previously was at NBC Sports Edge, does really phenomenal work, has like 500 player boards that I include into the consensus big board rankings. And anytime I ask him about like college football throughout the year, he always has like a super detailed answer. So I know that he's always kind of on top of these things. I got to bring him on for the draft show along with the next guest we're going to have, Corey Kinnan, just to get a variety of perspectives. But I really wanted to talk to Thor just because of all of the immense amount of work that he does in the draft. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing great. It's good to be on with you. I'm a listener to this podcast, so this is like a Truman Show moment for me.
No way, dude. All right. That's crazy that we have listeners.
Indeed.
All right, cool. So obviously, it's a Vikings podcast. You know the deal. There's been a lot of discussion about what the Vikings should do with their first pick, whether they should trade down, trade up, what position they should pick, kind of what the draft landscape looks like, and we'll get to that, right? But I just want to ask, if the Vikings don't pick a cornerback, what do you think the reasons for that would be, and what would you hope that they pick instead?
I think the reasons would be either they have a contingency to bring in a different veteran and or all the equity that they put into the defensive backfield through the draft these past couple years, in terms of making it even younger. I think that those would be the reasons not to do it. And I also think there's as big a holes at other parts of the roster, specifically wide receiver 2. And I'm on team draft the wide receiver 2 if you're staying in your slot in the first round for the Vikings.
Cool. And so because this is like a receiver class that's not characterized by a lot of size, right? There's a bunch of 5'9", 5'10" guys, bunch of guys with like system concerns, whether that's like Jalen Hyatt or Josh Downs or whatever, a bunch of guys with like slot only tags, maybe Zay Flowers, if that's what you feel about him or whatever. Do you think that kind of receiver would fit with a wide receiver to kind of role for the Vikings? What kind of receiver would you be interested in at 23 for the Vikings?
For the Vikings offense, Jackson Smith-Njigba, who is wide receiver 1 on a lot of boards, I don't know that he's a fit for the Vikings. And the reason why, it goes back to the Josh Oliver signing. That is a clear indication that the Vikings want to play regularly in 12 personnel. So that means that JSN would have to play on the outside for the Vikings. He's an absolute killer inside. He had the best agility scores, both the 3-cone and the short shuttle at this year's NFL draft, regardless of position, just dominated both those tests. But the lack of speed and the lack of juice, the lack of burst and acceleration, you see that manifested in his college film. He would get chased down by safeties, get chased down by linebackers. He's not running away from anyone in the NFL. So if you want to put him on the outside with only two true wide receivers, you're just going to have to know those limitations. His gameplay is so much better over the intermediate area when he has the spacing. That's what you've seen at Ohio State when they had Garrett Wilson on the one side and Chris Olave on the other side. Defenses had to respect that. It opened up an enormous amount of space in the intermediate area for him, and he is just impossible to stay with because he's got those jukebox joystick type agility moves. He's also a great route runner, even beyond that, like an intuitive route runner. He sets defenders up to fail, sort of gets like inside their head and then sets them up, tosses out the false tells and stuff like that. He's just impossible to stay with there. So he'd be a tough one. I think the other guys, they all more or less are fits for what the Vikings would want to do there. Quentin Johnson is the prototypical guy. He is that one size speed type guy at the top of the board there. He has some questions at the catch point, stuff like that we can talk about, and not the purest route runner. We can talk about all that. And then the other two, Zay Flowers, he gets pigeonholed by some people as a pure slot. They're wrong. He won on the outside in a horrible offensive environment consistently at Boston College, certainly has the movement for that. And then the one thing you're wondering about with those smaller guys, can they get off the line, number one, and can they catch the ball down the field? Zay Flowers is extremely difficult to jam at the line because his footwork is so sudden and unpredictable. And then down the field, he tracks the ball better than almost any of these smaller receivers we've seen come out the past couple of years. Again, that's all proven on tape and everything. So he can play outside in the NFL. And I think he would be, when you're projecting a guy for the Vikings, that guy is going to consistently be drawing the cornerback 2 on the other team. And he's always going to be getting single covered. because we know how defenses like to play Justin Jefferson with the over-the-top bracket help, sometimes straight double teaming him. That manifests on the other side in single coverage. The reason Adam Thielen isn't in Minneapolis anymore is because he couldn't consistently beat that anymore. Was still a good route runner, but he had just lost the athleticism. So he just couldn't create that separation. But once the Vikings have a guy that can consistently dominate in terms of that, create separation and make the plays against that single coverage, you're gonna put the defense to a hard decision. They're going to be either disincentivized from doing that with Jefferson to try to even that out more, or you have to play two high safeties. If you do that, now you've opened up an enormous amount of space in the intermediate area where Hawkinson and Oliver are going to eat in that. And then the last one is Jordan Addison, who, in terms of just pure football skills, he might be the best receiver in this class, but his measurables aren't there. He was like a mid 50th percentile size adjusted athlete. And and at sub 180 pounds. And that stuff, it's stuff that manifested on his game film. He is a very precise route runner. He's one of sort of those velvety, smooth guys, like on the move and stuff like that. He does cool things with setting up cornerbacks as far as like he'll win with the route early in the game. And then later in the game, he'll break it out like the exact same spot in the field, same formation against the same guy, and then go the other way. Like out of the route break, whatever, just on a dime, and the guy will try to jump it the other way. Now Jordan Addison's free. He does stuff like that all the time. So he's really advanced as far as the route running stuff, but the physical package just isn't dominant. But if you're projecting to play on the outside, luckily we got proof of concept of that last year. In 2021, Jordan Addison won the Biletnikoff Award at Pitt, working with Kenny Pickett out of the slot. Then last offseason, he takes a bag of cash to move across the country in NIL money to go to USC and play with Caleb Williams.
Yeah, NIL money. Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, and then Lincoln Riley, he put him on the outside, which I think was also a part of the sell job there. I think most of the sell job was probably the bag of money and the NIL stuff, but he also got to play on the perimeter, and he acquitted himself pretty well there. It's not a perfect profile because of some of those athletic limitations. He was only 2 for 9 in contested situations last year on the boundary, but he is going to beat single coverage. He did that consistently in college, even against the best corners he played.
All right, so that was like a really nice, expansive breakdown at the top of that receiver class. I think like one thing that kind of really stands out to me about the receiver class is that there is kind of like a chunk of players in, I'd say that second round range that people are pretty excited by, but are not really, enthusiastic about, as first rounders. We mentioned a couple of them. I know, Xavier Hutchinson, I think, is another one of those guys that could potentially be there. Tillman from Tennessee, along with Jalen Hyatt. And I know that that's all true, but I also know that, listening to some of these other podcasts, reading what other people have to say, that there are kind of receivers throughout the draft that people tend to be excited by. And I think that you and I are both in agreement that at some point they need to add a receiver. They do go cornerback first, and we'll get into that again. If they do go cornerback first, who are kind of the receivers in the middle and late rounds that really stand out to you as guys that could help specifically in this role? Because, they could get return guys, whatever, but specifically in a role where they could challenge KJ Osborne legitimately for a wide receiver 2 spot.
Yeah, when you're talking about guys in the middle rounds, Marvin Mims will be the guy on the top of my list if he gets there. He has been rising. He never should have flown into this draft process under the radar. That was only due to circumstances. Marvin Mims holds the all-time record in Texas high school football, and we know the kind of high school football Texas plays. It's like the high school hockey here in Minnesota. He is the all-time leader in Texas prep history in receiving yards. Then he goes to Oklahoma.
Good Lord. Okay.
Yeah, all time. He just put up video game numbers in high school. Then he goes to Oklahoma, gets on the field immediately, and was a star as a true freshman on that first Oklahoma team. The reason he's flying under the radar is because the next 2 seasons, the circumstances went against him at Oklahoma. He was still playing pretty well. But that first year, 2021, his true sophomore year, that the beginning of that season, Spencer Rattler, the former quarterback there, he was just in the tank. And he just could not pull himself out of it. And the whole rhythm of the offense was just screwed up because of that. And that might have been because Lincoln Riley, the aforementioned Lincoln Riley, had one foot out the door the entire time. He seemed to be negotiating with LSU during the season. He ends up audibling to USC immediately after the regular season. But Lincoln Riley was not as engaged as he generally is. That hurt the offense in 2021. Then in 2022, they hire Brent Venables, the Clemson defensive coordinator, who obviously doesn't know anything about offense or whatever. And the Sooners could not pick their offense off the mat last year. I think they finished 6-7. Their quarterback, Dylan Gabriel, was a transfer guy that came in, was okay. but just, he could not get it going, and he was injured for a little bit of the thing as well. So Marvin Mims did not get the same opportunities that he was getting as a true freshman these past couple of years. But he's a stud athlete, 91st percentile RAS. He's a little bit under 6 feet, and he's 183 pounds. But he's the other smaller receiver in this class that is a proven downfield killer, that is a proven boundary receiver. At Oklahoma, he played more on the outside than he did the inside. He did play slot as well, so that's a part of his repertoire as well. But Oklahoma loves setting him down the field because he just has a special skill for that. His ball skills are some of the best in this class. They might even be the best. If you put Marvin Mims as like his best 5 or 10 catches in college, and then you put every other prospect in this class their 5 or 10 best, you're probably going to vote Marvin Mims as the best one. He had some circus catches that just didn't even look real. He had one last year, I think it was at Texas Tech maybe, where he caught the ball behind a defender one-handed, where it was like, how did you even see that? And then even if you did, how did you catch that? It's like he just stuck his hand behind it, that, it was an errant throw, and he just speared this thing with one hand. This is a sub 6 foot wide receiver. Just some of these sick plays. So he'd be one. I don't know if he ends up going earlier in the 3rd round or in the late 2nd now because he's rising a bit. But if he somehow got down to the Vikings pick in the 3rd round, that would be absolutely perfect. Or the scenario where they trade down. A couple other ones. Michael Wilson of Stanford. He is a true outside receiver, and I know he can beat single coverage because he has a superpower in his athletic profile that gets under discussed. The reason he's flying into this process under the radar is because he was on and off the field the past 3 years with injuries. And he's coming from a bad offensive environment as well. A worse one than Mims, certainly. Stanford was just a joke of an offense these past couple of years. But Michael Wilson, almost 6'2", 216, 94th percentile size adjusted athlete. And the superpower in his profile that I was talking about, it's something that doesn't get discussed much because it's not a combine test. But when we saw it down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl, he was consistently creating separation, and he had as many of those like oohs and ahs from the crowd when he just totally, like with the defender, would try to slam on the brakes with him at the route break, try to crowd it or whatever, and he'd be skidding backwards. He couldn't stop as fast, or he'd go the other way or whatever. Like Michael Wilson was, even just in terms of the separation, was eliciting the oohs and ahs in the crowd. The superpower I'm talking about, so Arif, as you know, they do the zebra tracking now at the Senior Bowl where they put the chips in and they track everything you do, that's in the balls, it's on the players, whatnot. They give you the max speed of each player during the week, and then they give you some other really cool stats about, how they were doing on the field and stuff. Max deceleration, max acceleration, different stuff like that. There was only 2 players at this year's Senior Bowl, and I'm talking regardless of position, that finished top 15 in terms of their max speed score and top 5 in terms of their max deceleration. And Michael Wilson was one of them. The other one, I believe, was Trey Palmer from Nebraska, which that one makes sense because he's an athletic freak. But Michael Wilson is a bigger, like I said, 216 pounds. His ability to slam the brakes on wherever he wants is special for a wide receiver but you just don't see wide receivers that big that like at any point in the route break can just immediately slam on the brakes and then cut the clean corner. That is what is special about him. Again, you didn't get to see as much of the manifestation at Stanford because he was on and off the field, and then he would have to work his way back when he got back off of injury, stuff like that. But it's apparent, like when you watch his film, you do see some of those flashes of that stuff. We certainly saw a lot of it at the Senior Bowl, and that's a guy that is going to be available in round 3, maybe even round 4, depending on how teams see his medicals.
All right, so let's go back to that first round discussion. Let's say we're taking a cornerback there, which I think a lot of people expect, probably more likely before free agency than after free agency. But, there's a lot of options here. I think it is probably the case that Christian Gonzalez, Joey Porter Jr., and Devin Witherspoon will not be available for the Vikings at 23. Again, we don't actually expect the Vikings to pick at 23, but that's a reasonable proxy for, what will be available to them as they trade up or down in the draft. Out of the group that seems to be kind of set up for near the middle or the bottom of the first round, people like Cam Smith, Kelee Ringo, Deonte Banks, Emmanuel Forbes. I think that's basically that group there. Maybe Clark Phillips if you think the NFL is going to be really aggressive about him. I kind of have my doubts on that, but who knows? Out of that group, right, who do you think would be the best fit for the Vikings? And then if it's a different answer, who do you think is the best overall cornerback generally?
The best overall corner for sure is Devin Witherspoon. I don't care about the measurables of Christian Gonzalez. He's the Adonis one in this group, and he was a track star in high school, everything like that. But Devin Witherspoon is clearly a better player than he is on the field, and Devin Witherspoon proved for his part, the athleticism during the process. So for me, it's Devin Witherspoon, and I don't think Devin Witherspoon is lasting beyond the 6th slot. That is where Detroit picks. I think Detroit has tipped that off, both with what they've allowed to get out of that building and then also trading Jeff Okudah. I think they're sort of just telling you their intention there. Gonzalez, I don't think Gonzalez is going to be the first cornerback taken. He will be the second, though, whether that's at 9, 10, and it won't be long after that if he somehow gets past the Eagles. But then as far as where the Vikings are picking, I would say probably Deonte Banks. Just because of the size and athleticism package. He tested with a perfect 10 RAS. He's almost 200 pounds. He crossed that 6-foot threshold. And you see the stuff when he was at Maryland. He's really hard to shake. What you want to see more with him is the ball production. Some of the stuff like at the catch point, you like to see him get his head around, get his hands on balls, start picking balls off and whatnot. But as far as just being with the receiver at all times along his route, he is that guy, and he proved that the concept of the athleticism. You can stick him in the man coverage one-on-one in islands, which Brian Flores does a metric ton more than we saw with Ed Donashell last year in terms of that. So he'd be a fit for that. The other one that I would say, and in some mocks now, this guy's fallen to round 2, but for me, he's definitely a first-round player, is Cam Smith from South Carolina. He excelled for years there in the SEC, highest level of college football. He has the feet, he has the hips, he's a super feisty player, and the overall athletic profile checks out. He was only 180 pounds coming in, but a 9.7 RAS, 97 percentile at almost 6'1". And, again, he gets his hands on balls, he prevents completion, stuff like that. Really difficult to shake. He's kind of a gambler, but I think Flores is going to be okay with that. Some of Flores' defensive backs he's gone for in the past, they're those super aggressive, feisty guys that try to flip the field. So Cam Smith would be the other one. Some of those other guys, for me, I have to wait until the second round. We can't do it to Vikings fans to give the Vikings Emmanuel Forbes, because they're gonna start breaking out in cold sweats, remembering the Cam Dantzler experience.
Right.
They're not the same kind of player, but it's sort of that tall, super skinny kid coming out of Mississippi State that's going to do that. For me, Forbes is more of a second round guy. He obviously had a ton of interceptions in college. Those things don't always translate 1-to-1. He is a good corner, but for me, with that athletic profile, I got to put him round 2. Clark Phillips is going to fall too. It would be, you sort of alluded to this as far as his testing profile, 5'9", 184, only 54th percentile size adjusted athleticism. Clark Phillips is confined to the slot, but he's going to be a dang good slot. I was mentioning before about how Jordan Addison would get separation on damn near everybody he played in college, except one. Clark Phillips put him in witness protection every time Utah played USC. You would see Jordan Addison on a milk carton. Jordan Addison would be walking back to the tunnel, and Clark Phillips was still in his back pocket. He just could not get rid of the guy. So I know that Clark Phillips don't test as well. And for the Vikings, if he did fall down to them in acceptable range, let's say he gets into the third round, the Vikings have a pick there. Could they trade up, or in a trade down scenario, maybe they pick up another pick? He's absolutely a guy that I could see there. He's another one of those feisty guys and stuff like that. And this is the cool thing with the signing of Byron Murphy. The Vikings, they've already said, just outright, it's not just indications. They've said this publicly. They intend to play Murphy in the slot when they have a nickel defender out there. And when it's just the two corners, they're going to play him on the outside. That answer alone alludes to the fact that Murphy can play both. And we've seen that both with his time at Washington, also his time with the Arizona Cardinals in the NFL. If the Vikings were to get a guy like Clark Phillips on a steal of a price point, like let's say he fell down to the Vikings in the third round, which is actually theoretically possible. It would have been unthinkable to think that, even a couple months ago, but just because of that athletic profile, those types of guys do tend to fall down. If he's available to the Vikings there, if it's me, I take him. And then I tell Byron Murphy, hey man, you're now an outside corner. So congrats. You're going to be out there as our CB1 every single week. So that gives the Vikings a little bit of flexibility, no matter who they're looking at to draft as a cornerback. Because if it's a slot guy that's the best value, then you can just kick Murphy out. Otherwise, you get the outside guy, you keep Murphy in the slot.
So this is not a wonderful, by the way, thank you for all of that. That was fantastic. This is not a wonderful linebacker class, but it doesn't strike me as an awful one either. Do you trust Jordan Hicks, Brian Asamoah, linebacker group, or should the Vikings kind of do something about that in the third or fourth round with one? And again, because the Vikings might move in the first round, because they might trade Dalvin Cook or Za'Darius Smith, they might end up second, third round, or fourth round picks that we don't currently have. They only have 5 picks right now, but they might end up with more picks. Do you think that the Vikings should invest maybe a third or fourth round pick at a linebacker? And if so, if the answer is no, that's fine too. But if so, kind of who stands out to you as somebody that might be able to play in the Flores system?
The question, or the answer to the latter question about should they, in fourth or fifth round, emphatically yes, they should. And then a 2-part response to the first question about do I trust Asamoah and Hicks? I agree with the decision to have Asamoah out there now, like to start him, roll forward with him. I don't trust Jordan Hicks at all. Asamoah should have been starting last year at a certain point. Objectively, he was, arguably the best linebacker they had on the roster at that point. So I mean, he's got to be on the field. Jordan Hicks, though, I don't trust that guy. I would at least want to draft a guy that would be his replacement. Obviously with the contract restructure, it's basically just a 1-year deal for Hicks. It might literally be a 1-year deal for Hicks, and after that, you got to move on from that guy. He's just too slow-footed. And so, yeah, I would want a developmental guy. With how many holes the Vikings have, I like the way that you set that up, because you're not going to use one of those first couple picks on the linebacker position. Just going to roll it forward with Hicks for a year. But, yeah, I think, in the middle rounds, whatever, you mid to late rounds, you take that guy that you think could potentially replace him. A couple guys that I would keep in mind for that, Avon Pace Jr. of Cincinnati is really intriguing to me. He's a little bit on the shorter side, but he's 231 pounds. And with freak athleticism in terms of the speed, in terms of the movement, stuff like that. And on the field last year, he was one of the best linebackers in this class. In fact, he might have had the highest grade of any linebacker in this class. His pass rushing grade was elite. His run defense grade was elite. He didn't miss tackles despite having that smaller frame, which is something you always look for in those smaller linebackers. And he's still coming along in coverage, but he was decent in that. And you can project him for more because of that athleticism and because you've seen the instincts in some of these other phases of the game. It was just sort of a usage thing with Cincinnati. Another linebacker sort of in the same phylum is Dorian Williams from Tulane, who's a little bit smaller, almost 6'1". He's 228 pounds. He also tested really well, 87 percentile athlete. And one of the interesting things about Dorian Williams, not only was he really good last year, as Tulane, they just shot up as a program. They ended up winning the AAC and then beating USC in the title game. But Dorian Williams, you get sort of the high-end athlete with a guy who has sort of misleading dimensions, because while he's a bit smaller, he has a ludicrous wingspan. I don't have the number right in front of me, but I think he has like a 6'6" wingspan or something like that for a guy who's 6 foot and 6'8". So that's sort of interesting too. And his advanced profile is really promising. He is awesome in coverage. Dorian Williams, one of the better guys in this class at that. So those would be a couple guys that I would look at mid-round as far as a linebacker if they get there.
All right. And then I think kind of like the big question for the Vikings is quarterback, right? So the Vikings, had an opportunity to extend Kirk Cousins. Cousins' team put forth an offer for a short-term extension, about $40 million a year. In most circumstances, probably actually a pretty fair deal given the quarterback market. Vikings seemingly turned that down, right? And so that signals to us that there's probably some chance of a rookie quarterback. And we see some tweets, every so often that's something that they're interested in. So seems like there's some steam. Pretty confident that those top 4 are just not going to be an option for the Vikings for whatever reason, right? That's fair. So the question is, and we've seen a little bit of Hendon Hooker mocked to the Vikings in the first round. I still don't think that that's going to happen. But the question is, if the Vikings, let's say, trade down and grab some picks or acquire picks in some other way, if they have second and third round picks that they can spend at quarterback, are there any guys that you're interested in?
Yeah, I'm definitely not interested in Hendon Hooker either in the first round or the second round. And in
or the
fact,
second.
Yeah, even if Hendon Hooker got to the Vikings pick in the third round, that's more his acceptable value range, in my opinion. I don't even think I'd take him there if I was the Vikings. Like, why are you going to take a guy that's not going to play as a rookie? It's going to be 26 years old as a rookie, and then has all the on-field issues that he has in his profile, which we can talk about in a second. When you have Cousins under contract next year, like, I don't understand why he wouldn't just roll it forward. He would not seem to be, just in terms of the profile, like someone that the Vikings with limited draft equity should invest in. Certainly not in the first round. To me, that would be absolutely egregious. As far as guys like, realistic possibilities in the mid to late rounds, the list for me, it would be Tanner McKee from Stanford, Aiden O'Connell from Purdue, which would just be super fun because you'd have the O'Connell fit there, the mentorship, whatnot. And then Jake Haener from Fresno State. Jake Haener really impressed me at the Senior Bowl. He had a great career. Like, he started out at Washington. He was stuck early on the depth chart, went to Fresno State and just destroyed the G5 the last couple of years. And he went to the Senior Bowl, and he was like clearly the leader out there. Certainly was the best quarterback that we saw at the Senior Bowl. He has the physical limitations for sure. He's short, he's skinny, he does not have a bazooka for an arm. And he's only like a solid athlete. He's not going to scramble around and like steal you yards, whatnot. But
you were doing such a poor job of selling this guy.
Here's the sell job, Arif. I'm just set it up. He reminds you a lot of Brock Purdy from last year, where it's like, yes, he's physically limited, but he makes the right decision every single day in play. Like, he knows his limitations and he does the correct thing with the ball. And so if you're a coach that loves your system and just wants the quarterback to run your system, just like Brock Purdy was your dude, Jake Haener is your dude in this class, in my opinion, just because of his ability to process whatnot. It's going to allow him to overcome some level of those limitations in his profile. And we'll see, if he could become a Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy, that in itself was circumstantial because of how good the coaching is there, the plan, and then how good the skill players are, whatnot. But the Vikings have pretty good skill players, and I think that we trust the offensive acumen of Kevin O'Connell and those guys. So that could definitely be a fit as well. Those would be the three guys that I would prioritize with a pick like that.
What do you think Jake Haener's S2 score was?
Well, it wasn't number one because Daniel Jeremiah inadvertently let that one slip out of the bag. But maybe he was number two. I don't know. I'm going to have to text Jeremiah and see if I can figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. So one name that has been connected to the Vikings, and this would obviously be kind of a later pick, but is Dorian Thompson-Robinson from UCLA. I mean, you didn't mention him as one of the three that you were kind of interested in. So I kind of want to know what your thoughts are on him.
I think, it's funny. I started to hear probably about a year ago, maybe a little bit longer, that all the scouts were comping him to Tyler Huntley. It's really hard not to see that when you watch him play. It's like the same physical dimensions, same athletic package, and sort of the same limitations. He'll be able to move an offense for you and not embarrass himself if he's in the game. He's also a great leader. Like, go back and watch the UCLA USC game last year. UCLA came up just short in part because Thompson-Robinson threw an interception at the end of that game. But for all of the game before that, he had the entire team on his back. And it was both like the scrambling outside of the pocket, stealing yards, and then taking the free completions when they were there and everything like that. He's just a leader, and you can tell that the team rallies around him. He certainly has the athleticism. The Vikings like to bootleg their quarterbacks out, do stuff like that. Dorian Thompson-Robinson would be super efficient with that and super clean with that sort of stuff. The only questions that I have about his profile, it's the stuff in the pocket. He's never going to dominate from the pocket. He doesn't have a big-time arm, and he doesn't process the field as well as a couple of those guys that I mentioned earlier. But he definitely has athletic tools, and there is something to say for him for sure. He would be the guy for me where, like, if I didn't get that guy, let's say like in – use my third round pick on that, or I didn't spend a fourth, but now we're in the fifth and all those guys are off the board. That's when we would start to talk about Dorian Thompson-Robinson.
All right. So, man, we got a lot of information in here. We didn't talk a ton, I think, about some other positions that are kind of interesting. I think like edge rusher, for example, offensive guard, tackle, that kind of thing. But your ideal kind of Vikings draft, let's say they acquire a second round pick somehow. So they've got at least 6 picks. What does it look like to you?
outside of that sort of bonanza thing of the Cardinals panicking and trading back, and the
Right.
Vikings, coupling some future first round picks and going up and getting CJ Stroud, seems like he's going to be available at 3. Outside of that, it would be taking the wide receiver with the round 1 slot, probably adding to the secondary with the round 3. Whether that's a nickel guy, the pure cornerback nickel, like a Clark Phillips, whether that's one of those safeties, it's just a nickel defender. Brian Branch is the best example of that in this class. Obviously, he ain't going to be there. But there's other guys in this. Antonio Johnson's the round 2 guy where he's listed as a safety, but he only plays the nickel defender role. That could be something, or whether it's the outside corner, because obviously the Vikings still need outside corner as well. I'd start out with that, and then I'd augment the roster, kind of like we were talking about with some of these other positions. I would, the Vikings only have, I think, 3 picks outside of that. One of those I'd earmark for that developmental linebacker. I would consider the quarterback thing if that doesn't work out early to bring one in. Obviously, Nick Mullins is not the quarterback of the future. And as you mentioned before, it seems like the indications are the Vikings are making contingency plans to potentially move on from Kirk Cousins after this year. So that one would make a lot of sense. And then I think the other thing to monitor is what's going on with Dalvin Cook. We know that the Vikings have had some trade discussions. Have they not traded Dalvin Cook because it was a price point thing, or because the other team put some sort of contingency with his medical stuff on there? But I was a little bit surprised that they gave money to Alexander Mattison in lieu of that, just because of the financial restraints that the team has. So to me, that sort of tipped off that Dalvin Cook could be on the move here. Also, we've gotten some very glowing reports from our friend Pelissero coming out about Dalvin Cook's rehab. I think Pelissero may have had a Vikings birdie in his ear being like, hey, Tom, you should tweet this out. Maybe help out his trademark or whatnot. It'll be interesting to see during the draft if that's a time where the Vikings could potentially try to make that move. And if they do, running back becomes a priority ad in either round 3 or round 4. And this running back class is very good. So this would be a good year to have to do that if you're going to a guy that you could pair with Madison. But those would be sort of my top priorities there.
All right. That's dope. Who is your favorite player in the class in terms of somebody that nobody's talking about that we haven't already mentioned?
Oh, well, I would say, at running back, a local kid that I love is Evan Hall, who is super underrated. If we're talking about that guy that you compare with Madison and Chandler, in a post-Delvin world, if that's what it gets to, Evan Hall would make a ton of sense, and you're going to get him at a discount because he was stranded in one of the worst. We talked about a couple horrible offensive environments some of these prospects came out of. Evan Hall was in just about as bad a one as you could be in. Northwestern went 1-11 last year. Arif, this is the best stat from college football last year. There was only 2 teams in college football that were undefeated on a continent. Georgia, who won the national title, was one of them. The other one was Northwestern, who went 1-11, but happened to beat Nebraska in Ireland in the opener. So they were undefeated in Europe. They were the only other team to go undefeated on a continent. But the rest of the season, that team was an absolute joke. They just happened to catch Nebraska when Scott Frost was trying to get fired in the first month of the season so he could increase his buyout. He had a really wonky contract or whatever. But anyhow, Evan Hall is one of the most versatile receiving weapons in this entire class. You look at the percentages of the amount of snaps he was outside, in the slot. He's damn near the top of the class, receiving yards, receptions, all the way down to the advanced A-dot, everything like that. You get that utility of him, the versatility, whatnot. Also the clean routes out of the backfield and the sure hands. So you have all that stuff. I think he's underrated, and he less so now, but coming into the process was crazy underrated in 2 elements, both his running and then also his athletic profile. Speaking to the latter, if you looked around at scouting reports of Evan Hall in January, even in February before the combine, people were predicting he was going to run a 4.6, which was an absolute joke. That guy was a high school track star, and the speed was apparent on film in the very few instances when he got to gallop in the open field, which did not occur much because even though he was playing behind Peter Skoronski, the other 4 guys in that offensive line were brutal, and the passing game was non-existent at Northwestern, so defenses could key in on Evan Hall, whatnot. But the speed was there. He also has the lateral agility and the burst. He proved the concept to all that stuff at the NFL Combine. Those are the things that lead to him being an underrated runner. I also think he has the vision. There'd be a lot of times where he'd get confronted by penetration, immediately right after he got the ball. He would sense it immediately. He'd get flat, get lateral down the line, and then bounce that thing outside. but he's not one of those guys that appears to have picked up the bad habits. Like, Cam Akers was a guy in college that played with a terrible offensive line in Florida State. He's got some scars from that. He sees ghosts sometimes. So, like, he'll do things that he shouldn't do, not follow the play concept because he's, hearkening back to that, whatnot. Evan Hull does not appear to be a guy that got scarred like that. So he would be my guy at running back. At wide receiver, it'd be Tank Dell from Houston. I don't know that he's a fit for the Vikings because he's a true slot at 5'8", 163. He did win on the outside of Houston, but with those dimensions, I almost think he has to play inside. But he, I just love his game. He creates separation, unlike most guys we've seen come out these past couple of years, because he moves so dang fluidly. It's like at the Senior Bowl on I think it was day 2 on the Wednesday. Dell had been torching everybody in the one-on-ones on Tuesday. And so it got hilarious on Wednesday because the cornerbacks just started grabbing his jersey out of the route breaks. And Arif, at those all-star games where they'll have like the play refs, that are out there, they usually don't throw flags. They actually had to throw a ton of flags on the Tank Dell one-on-ones because it was so egregious. The defensive backs are like, I'm not letting you embarrass me in front of the entire NFL again, Tank. So he'd be one. Puka Nacua would be one other one at the receiver position I tossed out from BYU, another kid we saw down at the Senior Bowl. He had another one of those snake-bitten careers where circumstantially he's viewed lower than he ought to be. When he was on the field, he's basically Debo Light. Like at the college level, like BYU would get him the ball in so many different ways, end arounds, shifting him into the backfield, and then he can win as a receiver. And he has decent size. You mentioned before this receiver class doesn't have great size. Puka Nacua is over 6'1", and he measured in at 206 pounds, but he played games in college over 210, and he has that athletic profile plus the versatility, can win in his routes. You notice how valuable Puka Nacua is. When he was when he was out of the games, he got injured. Not all of his fault. The injury that happened to him last year, it was because they were playing South Florida. BYU was. They gave him 2 end arounds in the first quarter. He runs both of them for touchdowns. And so the dopey BYU coach was like, let's do it again. And so they give him another end around. That time, South Florida's like, we're not going to let you do it again. And so they just all swarmed him. And then Puka Nacua was hurt for like the next month or whatever. But when he's on the field, BYU's offense played way, way up. When he was off the field, it played way down. If you want to evaluate Jaren Hall's tape from BYU, if Jaren Hall is not a guy that I'm high on, in part because of this reason, when Puka Nacua was off the field, his game cratered. I don't think that is, I don't think that's a coincidence.
Dope. Fantastic. I guess I framed that like it was the final question. I got one more question. This edge class, everyone loves Will Anderson. But I feel like I've just heard questions about every single other edge rusher. Is this edge rusher class actually good?
I think it is, yeah. But I think it's fair to like toss out a couple of those things in Will Anderson's profile. But like I would still take him in the top 5. But I think he's going to be number 5 on my big board. So, there's these reports now that the Texans, the worst run organization in the NFL, that they're somehow going to bypass a quarterback at 2 and then take Will Anderson or whatever because they love him so much. He's a good player. He piled up a bunch of production at Alabama, but there is some stiffness there, and he's not a big time athletic monster or whatever. Was a shade under 6'4", 253, and then he ducked a lot of the athletic tests. Does have that production. Like I said, I'd take him around the 5th or the 6th pick, but I can't get there to the top 2 stuff. Tyree Wilson scares me. The dimensions are insane, obviously, but he did not break out until his 5th year, his 5th year senior season, whatever. And we did not get to see him test because unfortunately, I think it was like game 9 or 10 of that senior year, that this past season, it was in November, he got knocked out for the season with an injury. And so then that knocked out the end of his season and then also his pre-draft process. I would like confirmation that he is the freak athlete that he sometimes appeared to be on tape, but we're not going to get that in advance. But yeah, through to the end of the first round and then into day 2, I like this edge class. I'm probably lower on it in day 3 than some other guys. So for me, it's sort of a top heavy class a bit.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, man. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Fantasy Pros and Betting Pros, and I have the Score North show where we do a weekly NFL draft show, and you can find me on Twitter at ThorKU.
All right, fantastic, man. Have a good one.
You too, Arif. Appreciate it.
All right, I'm here with Corey Kinnan, editor at Browns Wire. He's done a little bit of draft work, so I asked him to come out of the podcast. We had Thor Nystrom on previously, so we're going to talk to Corey about some of the stuff that we couldn't cover with Thor and some of the stuff that maybe, I don't know, maybe he disagrees with Thor about. So how you doing, man?
I'm good. It's good to be back on. I was on with you when the Browns and the Vikings played in 2021, but it's been a while, so it's
been a bit. I remember I enjoyed talking to you. I mean, every so often we get like a bunch of guests in here that like really know their stuff, and then just they don't really have like the ability to really podcast back and forth, right? They don't have like the fluidity, and having you on, it's really nice having like a back and forth and having a really snappy response. Really easy to edit. How you doing, man?
Good. I appreciate that as well. I also think I'm pretty awesome. So yeah.
Fantastic. Let's talk about this year's draft first. I think kind of funny to have a Browns guy on to talk about the draft. What picks do the Browns have?
So after trading for Elijah Moore, they basically swapped pick 42 with the Jets to pick 74. So they basically fell back a full round, 32 spots to pick up Elijah Moore. So pick 74 is their first one, and then they have pick 98 and pick 111. They've got 6 picks between the third through fifth rounds. So those middle rounds will be pretty heavy, but nothing until pick 74.
All right, so they're going to get probably, I guess it depends on how they package things, but they're going to get players. It's just not anybody a lot of people are like very familiar with at the beginning of the draft.
Right. So, I mean, it was fun there for a little while to be like, oh, pick 42, what kind of first round player could fall? It happens every year. And now it's like, all right, pick 74. Like, who are we getting there? Who are we settling for?
All right, then. You were able to assemble like a big board of every player in the draft, not just people that Browns were interested in. You submitted 2 versions to me, one a final version, and I wanted to kind of like get your thoughts, just first of all, just generally on the draft class, and then also some positions that'll probably interest some of the Vikings fans that we have. So first, just the draft in general. We've got these 4 quarterbacks that everyone expects to go, I guess now in the top 10, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And then probably nothing for a while. I know I saw Hendon Hooker, mocked in the first round, specifically to the Vikings for a little bit. But it very much seems like we're going to get 4 in the first round. We're going to get 4 maybe in the top 10. We're not going to get anything for a little bit. What are your thoughts on just kind of that reality and whether or not that really makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Those 4 in the top 10. I'm especially looking at Arizona sitting at 3 with their starting quarterback hurt most of the season. Like it would make a lot of sense in the world for them to kick assets down the road a little bit. Will Anderson's a hard talent to kind of pass up on, I guess, but. 4 in the top 10 makes a lot of sense to me. I don't buy the Hendon Hooker stuff personally. I think his agent's kind of working overtime right now, the way agents do every year. But especially to the Vikings again, with Kwesi coming from Cleveland, he's got a very heavy analytical skew. Andrew Berry is his mentor. Like for one, they don't draft 25-year-olds, let alone a quarterback coming off of an ACL injury. So I don't buy the Hendon Hooker stuff. Like I don't buy him in the first round. I think second round is probably still a stretch, but I could see somebody pulling the trigger on him in the second round. So I think that makes sense the way we talk about the quarterbacks, but I really do think it's going to be 4 and then a pretty big gap till we get another one.
All right. And then what are your thoughts on like this question that people have about whether or not, because at this point, it very much sounds like Anthony Richardson could be the second quarterback off the board, despite the fact that basically the 1 and 2 for most of the draft season had been, Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. What are your thoughts on like this kind of move towards, I don't know if it's a move towards upside. The NFL has always been chasing upside of quarterbacks, but it feels like the certainty towards upside that I think we haven't seen in a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it's hard to know what to believe when you get this close to the draft. Anything from the combine on, it's kind of hard to like, what's real, what's not. But it really just seems like it's fully dependent on the Panthers. If the Panthers take CJ Stroud, then it sounds like Bryce Young's too. But if the Panthers don't take CJ Stroud, it sounds like Stroud could become the 3rd or the 4th quarterback off the board. But I do think the buzz around Anthony Richardson is real. Again, he's probably the most physically gifted quarterback we've seen in a very long time, maybe ever, at least since Cam Newton. And so I understand the appeal. I would understand the appeal for a team like Indianapolis that just watched what Shane Steichen did with Jalen Hurts and saying, well, Anthony Richardson is, a Ferrari version of Jalen Hurts, if he can get some of, the lower body stuff worked out to where his lower half is kind of not skewing his accuracy as much as it has at Florida. So I buy it. I do buy it. Again, Josh Allen, I think was probably a worse quarterback coming out than Anthony Richardson. And he's kind of developed he's still a pretty volatile passer, but what I think is interesting, and I've done a lot of quarterback charting and things too, is that I don't think NFL teams care as much about, that's probably speaking too overarching, because obviously the Shanahan guys, they love to work the short game. And as long as they have a quarterback who can operate the short game at a high level, they put him in a chance to win. But I really do think NFL teams are starting to say, you know what, I don't care about the short game as much, as long as we're hitting on some chunk plays, as long as we're creating explosives. And that's kind of what it is with Josh Allen. You know, he's not overly efficient working the short game, but for as inefficient he is, he'll have, 3-4 big chunk plays a game that kind of cover that up. And you're like, oh, this guy's good. And so I think there is kind of a skew towards that, and Anthony Richardson definitely fits that bill.
All right. And then kind of this final thing, a lot of people have been expressing skepticism about Hendon Hooker. We had Thor do that a little bit. I've done it. And some of that has to do with the age. You mentioned that. Some of that has to do with the ACL. You mentioned that. But what exactly about his on-field play? I mean, because very much if Hooker was playing like Bryce Young was playing, but was 25 and had the ACL, he would probably go like 13 or 12 or something like that, right? Like, obviously the injury concerns and all that would still, but like he would go very high. So there's something else here that's making people hesitate on Hooker. What is it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you have to point out is how juvenile, the Tennessee offense is. Like it's pure air raid. It's pure nines or screens. Like that's pretty much it. So I think just how juvenile passing concepts are that he's working at the college level versus a playbook, NFL playbook he's going to have to learn when he gets into the NFL, could cause for a steeper learning curve. And when your quarterback's already 25, like how much of a learning curve can you give that guy realistically? Mm-hmm. So I think that causes for a little bit of panic. And again, playing in that air raid, I don't think a lot is asked of him in his lower half. So I do think his feet are heavy. His feet are slow, not exactly crisp when he's getting back in his drop. I think he's got an arm. He can extend plays, obviously, with his legs. He can run. You can manufacture runs for the guy. So, I mean, as far as we're speaking about tools, he has them. I don't think he has a Richardson level arm, but I think, him and CJ Stroud's arms are probably comparable. But I would say playing in gun at Tennessee exclusively, again, he's not really asked to really sharpen up his drops, to really work on his feet. And then just, again, how steep is that going to be for him to learn an NFL playbook from running an offense at Tennessee that is just very juvenile, very juvenile. So I think that plays into it a little bit too.
All right. I mean, yeah, that all makes sense. Now let's talk about like some players that it really seems like it's very likely that the Vikings will be in on. I think those top three corners probably not going to be within striking distance for the Vikings. Devin Witherspoon, Christian Gonzalez, Joey Porter Jr., probably not, right? So that means we're taking a look at players like Cam Smith, like Deonte Banks, maybe Clark Phillips, Emmanuel Forbes, a couple of other players there. Out of that group, out of that group that the Vikings are likely to, Keely Ringo from Georgia, out of the Cam Smith, Keely Ringo, Deonte Banks, Emmanuel Forbes, and let's just throw Clark Phillips in there as well. Out of that group of five, who's your favorite and why, and what separates these players from each other to you?
Yeah, so good news for the Vikings fans in this conversation, I guess, is that I think Deonte Banks is better than Joey Porter Jr. So if we're including Joey Porter Jr. in that,
this is fantastic. So Deonte Banks is my favorite out of this group, and Thor just said the same thing. Everybody I've talked to likes Deonte Banks. This is fantastic news.
I love Deonte Banks. I love Deonte Banks. So again, Joey Porter Jr. is a good player. I think is a good way to start that. But Joey Porter Jr., I think, relies a lot on his length. I don't think his press tech is as clean as it could be because he can get away with it for how physical he is at the line of scrimmage. But I also think that kind of bites him at the top of his routes when he is playing a little bit of off man. I think he's quite grabby as well. And again, Deonte Banks just tested like one of the best corners of all time at the combine. And I do think his press tech is very smooth. Very smooth. He knows. I guess a big separator is I tend to pick people's brains when I have a question, and a DB guy I really trust who played college level DB who I asked him, I was watching a guy once and I was like, hey man, like this guy doesn't really use his hands in press tech. Is that a big deal? And the guy's like, no, you want to stay, like you need to win with your feet first. You need to win with your feet first. You don't even really have to throw your hands as long as you're staying square and you're mirroring. And I was like, oh, that's good to know. And I think Joey Porter Jr. is very much a hands first kind of guy where Deonte Banks is very feet oriented. Again, the long speed's there. And then he's physical, man. Like that dude will hit. He'll come downhill and tackle. There's a rep against Ohio State where he doesn't even, they're running a mesh concept and that second drag across the mesh doesn't even get off the line of scrimmage because he pins him at the line of scrimmage. Like there's just a lot to like about Deonte Banks, man. And he's personable. Like I spoke to him at the combine. He's really funny. Like there's just a lot to love about Deonte Banks.
Perfect. And then Thor mentioned that he had some reservations about Kelee Ringo. I know my podcast partner on Locked On Vikings Network, Luke Braun, also has reservations about Kelee Ringo. Do you have any concerns about this guy? What are they?
One, he's an explosive athlete. I think he's slow to open his hips. And so I think he's playing catch up a lot. I think he's guessing a little bit when trying to anticipate route concepts. Like if you watch the Peach Bowl, man, Marvin Harrison's routing him up. And again, he didn't get a target on all those, so he didn't get really credited for a bunch of that. But I feel like he's just guessing a lot, and then he's playing catch up based off of that. And he has really good tools at the college level to kind of recover, but that gap's closing rapidly at the NFL level. And then his ball skills, man, I don't think he can locate the football when the ball's in the air. I think he really struggles to make a play on the ball, which becomes a huge issue at the catch point. He gets beat up a lot at the catch point. So those two things give me a lot of pause with Kelee Ringo. And so, where I go then is like, who's CB5 then? If all four of those, Porter Jr. and Banks are off the board with Witherspoon, Gonzalez, I would probably lean Emmanuel Forbes as that kind of that next guy in that group then.
All right. And, a lot of people have compared, especially in the Vikings universe, Emmanuel Forbes to Cameron Dantzler, right? Because, they're very familiar with Cameron Dantzler. Mm-hmm. Both come from the same school. But both of those are less important than the fact that we just don't see cornerbacks ranked this high, this skinny, right? So,
yeah, he was sub 170 at the combine, which is unheard of.
Yeah, it's wild. Well, you see that, but you don't see that for players as tall as he is, right? And you don't see it for players expected to start on the outside, right? Like it's a wild kind of situation to consider.
It really is. But a fun fact, I read an article. It was Peter King, actually. Emmanuel Forbes can actually throw a 95-mile-an-hour fastball and was going to play baseball until he was going to need Tommy John surgery, then made the switch to full-time football and said, I don't want to do that. So that's a fun fact. But he's twitched up, man. He's so twitchy. He's so explosive. He's got a good trigger. He's a ball hawk. So, as thin as he is, and yeah, it shows up in the run game. It shows up in his ability to deconstruct blocks. But in terms of pure coverage, I don't see a lot of Cam Dantzler comparisons because Dantzler's quite a bit thicker. Dantzler's quite a bit stiffer as well. Predominantly a cover 3 guy off zone quite a bit, where they trusted Forbes to do a lot more closer to the line of scrimmage, a lot more one-on-one with receivers. So yeah, the size is a concern. It shows up in the run game. It shows up. But man, is he twitched up? Man, is he a ball hawk? And those things are hard to look past.
All right. And then I think that discussion comprises a lot of the discussion that a lot of people have about what the Vikings could pick there. But it's entirely possible that the Vikings trade down, grab another second-round pick or something along those lines, right? Find another way to get one, because they only have 5 in the draft. Maybe not quite as depleted as the Browns are, but they only have 5 picks right now. They're probably going to trade down, which means that it's very possible that they, select a receiver at pick 30 or something like that, and then select a corner with a second or third round pick. We'll talk about those receiver options in a second, but I do want to get an understanding of, a lot of people talk about how great this cornerback class is. And as it stands with what we've discussed, that's absolutely true. But one thing that we haven't really talked a lot about is the depth, right? Whether or not, somebody like Julius Brents, right, is somebody that's, really worth, thinking about investing time in. Tyreek Stevenson, right? DJ Turner. I mentioned Clark Phillips really quickly. Both, a couple of these guys I just mentioned are nickel guys. That's why they're considered second, third round prospects. But, there are a couple of guys here that people either like a lot or don't like very much in these middle rounds. People like Eli Ricks, I know he's polarizing. People like Garrett Williams, I haven't seen a ton of conversation on. The kid from Stanford, Q Blue Kelly. a lot of cornerbacks that could be available in the second and third round that the Vikings might actually target if with their first pick they go with a quarterback or a receiver. So like out of that mid-round group, and feel free to name people I haven't named yet. Out of that mid-round group, who kind of stands out as somebody, especially somebody who might be able to manage in a blitz-heavy man coverage scheme?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Julius Brents, and I think that's a good place to start. I think NFL teams, I could see Julius Brents going a lot higher than people anticipate as well, especially based off of what Sauce Gardner and Tariq Woolen did last year, where, twitched up long corners, kind of came in as rookies and dominated. I think NFL teams might kind of say, oh, I want that, because Julius Brents is long and he's twitched up. He has no problem flipping his hips. Just a really good athlete for how big he is, for his size. So I think Julius Brents is a good place to start. He's 34th on my board, and I know I'm higher on him than most.
It's pretty high.
Yeah. You mentioned Garrett Williams too, man. Garrett Williams is so interesting because his tape is so good. Like, even this year, like, it's so good. And I really do think like his feet are sweet. And like, if he were healthy and didn't have season ending injuries in 2 straight seasons, like, we could be talking about him top 32. But again, he did just tear his ACL. Again, he had a season ending injury in 2021 as well. So like, that's pretty steep medicals to look past. But I really do like him. Another guy that you didn't mention that I'll throw out is Purdue's Corey Trice. Mm-hmm. Another long guy, missed 4 total tackles in his entire career at Purdue. Long, athletic guy as well. Tested really well at the combine. Has comfort and press man. And I've seen this dude work effortless, or like willingly and with a ton of effort in backside pursuit, like 50 yards from the opposite outside corner to catch somebody before they get to the end zone. Like, he's willing to put in the work in the run game. So I appreciate that a lot. So Corey Trice is a guy that I really like as a 5th year. His medicals also are kind of iffy. During his time in college, you mentioned DJ Turner. I think DJ Turner could be more, I would tend to place him more in that nickel conversation. Same with Clark Phillips. I love Clark Phillips' tape, but we're talking about 2 outliers now with him. Like, I can be okay with 1 outlier, his size, but then he goes to the combine and he doesn't test well. So that puts 2 outliers on him, and that's a little bit steep for me to want to talk about top 64, really. Tyreek Stevenson, I'm a little bit lower on him than others, but I would say, yeah, Brents, Trice, Williams, all 3 would be good options in that second round range. DJ Turner too, I would throw him in there too.
All right, and then I think this conversation about receivers is really interesting. As I was talking to Thor, I mentioned that a lot of these guys have size concerns, and he's a little bit more optimistic about some of these smaller players having the ability to play on the outside, people like Zay Flowers. But generally speaking, you've got a couple of guys, Jordan Addison, Quentin Johnston, that have the kind of size you'd think you'd be able to manage on the outside. The Vikings having cut Adam Thielen and having, I don't know if uncertainty is the right word, but would have to rely on KJ Osborne as wide receiver 2. Some Vikings fans are enthusiastic about it. Certainly he has promise, but maybe you don't want to just hand him a job. When you're taking a look at these receivers, thinking about adding a receiver 2 to complement Justin Jefferson, yeah, they're going to throw, Josh Oliver out there and play more 2 receiver sets, but it feels like they might need some real competition wide receiver 2. If they select a wide receiver at the bottom of the first round, who do you like in that role? And then outside of that, in the middle rounds, what kind of stands out to you as a guy that could maybe complement Jefferson?
Yeah, so I guess I would preface that by, are you more speaking of a guy with some size, or do you think the Vikings would be okay with two dudes about Jefferson's size as long as they can separate do whatever they need to do?
Well, certainly, I think it kind of depends on what you think, right? Because if Flowers, who doesn't have the size, can play on the outside, then who cares, right? But they're going to be in a lot of 2 receiver sets. And so with that in mind, are you going to trust a Jalen Hyatt or a Josh Downs or something like that to play on the outside opposite that? I'm just trying to get your read on whether or not you think some of these guys can play on the outside, because it's just, can in a 2 receiver set you trust this guy to play on the outside opposite Justin Jefferson? And if the guy is like 5'6" or whatever and you trust him, that's a good answer too.
Yeah.
But that is, the concern with this receiver class, is that those guys might not exist because it just seems less likely for guys that are below 5'10" to be able to do that.
Right. Yeah, I will say I would agree with Thor on guys. I'm not a huge guy on Flowers, but I think there are some smaller dudes who played 80, 90% outside the numbers, like Marvin Mims, if we talk about those middle rounds, late second, early third, out of Oklahoma. Marvin Mims he's a pretty darn good football player. Another guy I really like in the second round is Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati. Like I love Tyler Scott out of Cincinnati. Again, he's only 5'9" as well, but I think he creates blind spots really well. He's really twitchy, explosive long speed, but knows how to throttle and control that tempo. So he can get in and out of breaks really, really violently with a nice hip sync. So, but if we're talking big guys, and again, this is where it gets kind of difficult because, again, I know who Kwesi is, and I know that him and Andrew Berry kind of have similar philosophies when it comes to drafting guys. And so there are a couple of bigger receivers that I like, but they're kind of older. So does Kwesi have those kind of same age guardrails that Andrew Berry tends to have? But like I like Cedric Tillman out of Tennessee. He's a big bodied dude who's I think flying wildly under the radar. I think he's going to be best bang for buck receiver in this class. A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest is another bigger body guy who moves really well, really smoothly for his size. So those would be two dudes who are a bit bigger. Once you get into maybe second, third round, that like I think they would be really good players. Late third or early fourth, you got Xavier Hutchinson out of Iowa State, Jonathan Mingo out of Ole Miss that I like a bunch in kind of that range as well.
When you take a look at the top of this receiver group, it feels like people aren't even confident about that. I mean, people are pretty happy about Jackson Smith-Njigba, but I think obviously there's no like dominant, obviously we love this guy as a top level. I mean, he's not going to be considered the same way that Marvin Harrison Jr. will be considered next year, right? And then Quentin Johnston has all these questions. A lot of people expected him to run faster. Thor alluded to his catch technique, which I think a lot of people are concerned about his body catching, not a decent route runner. Jordan Addison has a number of concerns. I think age, for example, is one of them. I think the athletic capability is kind of another one. Do you think that there is a dominant receiver in this class, or should we all be kind of content with the idea that, hey, not every class can be like 2020 and 2021?
I think we just need to be content with what we got. It's a pretty bad wide receiver class, all things considered. Again, I do think Jackson Smith-Njigba's kind of come back around to the consensus wide receiver one, which is really funny because people really like crapped on him for chunks of the season. And then he went out and tested and like, oh yeah, this guy's wide receiver one again. And it's like, okay, like he was always there. But I do think we just need to be kind of content. And if I were the Vikings, I would go in with what's a role that we need to fill and who's a guy that can fill that role rather than we need a wide receiver too who can be that guy if Justin Jefferson gets hurt. Because I really don't think I think you could get maybe a solid wide receiver too, but the way that I like to think about a wide receiver too is it needs to be really a wide receiver 1B, because if your 1A goes down, like that's your guy. And I don't see that guy in this class. I just really don't. So I think minimizing it to what's a specific role that we need to fill and minimizing your board then to like, well, which receivers fit that role.
Do you think teams need to do that just a little bit more often, or do they do that already and we don't consider that when we're draft analysts, like trying to identify players by role instead of players by position?
I would say the NFL teams probably do more frequently than analysts tend to, than like draft nicks tend to. But I also think that NFL teams might do it a little bit too much. Like I'm going back to 2021, like the Browns knew, for example, since I'm pretty well versed in the Browns, that we need a guy who can take the top off of a defense. Like we need to find that guy. And they drafted Anthony Schwartz, and because of his track speed, and he can't catch a football. And meanwhile, then the Amon-Ra St. Brown slips to the Lions like pretty quickly after that. So I do think teams can get a little more locked in on that, but I do think this is a class where you can say like it's going to be tough sledding to find a guy that can really do that. Again, I do think Tyler Scott can become that guy. I do think Jordan Addison could become that guy. I do think maybe Marvin Mims could become that guy. Cedric Tillman could become that guy. But for the most part, I think there's a lot of role players in this class.
Sure. So kind of switching tacks, but keeping in mind that, both the teams that we cover are very analytically minded. Let's say the Vikings actually have the capacity to trade Dalvin Cook. Let's say, I don't know, they get a good deal. It's a third-round pick. They replace him 1-to-1 with a third-round pick, just like they replaced first-round pick Stephon Diggs with a first-round pick Justin Jefferson. They replaced Dalvin Cook that they trade for a third-round pick with a third-round pick at running back. First, is that an area where you're comfortable spending on a running back? Is that one where, analytically now we're kind of meeting something where we can be kind of comfortable? And second, of that group, you don't get a Bijan, you don't get Jahmyr Gibbs. You might not even get a Roshan Johnson, right, from Texas, the other Texas back. Who are those guys that might be able to kind of fill a role, maybe in a committee with Alexander Madison and Ty Chandler and Kenny Nwangwu, and maybe as kind of a lead guy? What are those guys that you feel can fit that role in that third, fourth round range?
Yeah. I think I would first start by saying I think NFL teams have less of an emphasis on positional value than analysts do. I think positional value is pretty overblown. So I don't think there's a skew away from running backs, especially even from guys like Andrew Berry or guys like Kwesi. So Roshan Johnson would be my guy there, but assuming he's off the board too, I would assume then that Devin Achane is off the board as well.
Yeah.
That's where I get into I like Kendry Miller out of TCU. Debo McBride out of UAB is a really violent runner. It stings that he's holding his, he's been hurt throughout the entire pre-draft process, and he's holding his workout on the 22nd. So the week before the draft. So we're not going to get any testing numbers on him or anything like that before it's too late for anything. But I do like Debo McBride a bit. Israel Abanikanda out of Pitt is a name that I really like.
A lot of draftniks seem to really like this dude, and before his testing came in, they like this dude.
He's explosive. If he's got green grass, good luck. I do think he's pretty linear, so he's not gonna be overly elusive or slippery in the open field. He's not gonna break a lot of tackles in space, make guys look silly, but he's just, I think he's a decisive runner. I think he's patient, and he's got insane burst. And once he hits that burst, it's off to the races. So Abaniganda's a guy. I'm lower, and I know a lot of people like Zach Charbonnet. For me, Zach Charbonnet is just ordinary. There's not a trait when I watch him that's he does this one thing really well. And then I think Tyjae Spears has to be in that conversation. He is pretty slippery. He's got a pretty good portfolio as a receiver out of the backfield as well. He's had a really good pre-draft process. So I think Tyjae Spears is a name that deserves to be in that conversation as well.
All right, yeah. And then the other scenario is maybe the Vikings trade Za'Darius Smith. He's requested a release. The Vikings have said, not in your life. But they might potentially, explore a trade option for him where he might be able to secure the deal that he's really looking for. The Vikings just don't have the ability to offer him that deal, at least from my understanding, especially after the Marcus Davenport deal. And so it's possible that they go for an edge rusher. I would imagine that at 30 plus years old, even coming off the season that Za'Darius Smith has had, he's probably not going to go for a first or second round pick. I think that's pretty easy to say. So if we're in that same conversation, we've got a third round pick at edge rusher. And there's been a lot of talk about these first, potentially second, but a lot of these first round edge rushers, a lot of talk about these fringe first round edge rushers, people like, Will McDonald IV, or people like Isaiah Foskey or BJ Ojulari. But when we get past them, I haven't seen, and this might just be because that's just what happens in the third round. We don't see a ton of discussion on these guys, but I haven't seen a ton of discussion. The only guy that is projected to go at about the third round, Andre Carter II from Army, a lot of people just dislike a lot. So I don't really know what to make of the middle, chunk of this. Is there a middle chunk? Is it all bad? Should we just ignore it?
No, I think there's some pretty good depth in the third round. I would probably consider Foskey in that depth. I think I'm lower on him than a lot of people are.
Okay. Yeah.
Felix Anudike-Uzomah, I'm a little bit lower on, but I tend to think he's going to go higher. But realistically, I guess we can talk about guys like Zach Harrison out of Ohio State is toolsy. He's explosive. He's got 36-inch arms. He's never left the city of Columbus. So I live in Columbus. So there's always the story of him running a sub 11-second 100-meter dash in the pouring rain in tennis shoes because they didn't make track spikes that fit his feet. He's overly explosive. He's pretty stiff though, so he's not going to be a guy that's going to bend the high side at a high level. But I really do think he reduced his game a lot this year and realized I'm a power guy. I have length. I have levers. I'm going to use those, and I think it helped him in the long run this year. Tuli Tuipulotu out of USC has some inside-out versatility. That's fun to play with as well. Derek Hall out of Auburn is wildly explosive, heavy hands. Again, also a pretty stiff guy that's more of a through-the-chest guy as a pass rusher than anything else. But another guy that I really like, I'm taking out guys like Nick Herbig and Yasir Abdullah, who I like, but they're more of situational pass rushers, maybe Sam linebacker kind of.
And both of them have been potentially projected to off ball as well.
Yeah, so I'm not going to include those guys, but I like Isaiah McGuire out of Missouri quite a bit as well.
Okay.
I think he could be a day one rotational player. I think his hips are pretty flexible for how big he is, so he can win high side. He's not overly explosive, not overly physical, But if you watch the Georgia game, like he got in Broderick Jones' chest quite a few times and converted speed to power on him a little bit. So Isaiah McGuire to Missouri is a guy that I like in that kind of 75 to 99 range, I would say.
Okay, awesome. As you kind of take a look at the Vikings roster, right? We've talked a little bit about kind of the primary needs. We didn't talk a little bit about linebacker, but linebacker, right? But as you take a look at the Vikings roster, you take a look at players that they have as an outside observer. Kind of what to you would be an ideal draft that's realistic for the Vikings? Let's say they acquire a second round pick as well.
Right. So I'm really bullish on Andrew Booth, but I don't think you can go into the season banking on Andrew Booth.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So I think corner, obviously looking at their depth chart at corner, like you're starting 2 second-year players right now. Like that, that's, I guess Byron Murphy, but he's got some nickel versatility as well. So I think corner is a huge issue. Again, we've talked about defensive end. Danielle Hunter's health has not been ideal. Marcus Davenport's on a 1-year deal. Depth behind that's not overly pretty, depending on what happens with Za'Darius. I think defensive tackle's a little shallow too. Dean Lowry, Harrison Phillips are decent players. Like I like Harrison Phillips quite a bit, but not a lot of depth behind them either.
So if you were to pick a defensive tackle like in the 4th round, especially because you probably are looking for a pass rusher with Harrison Phillips there, what strikes you as a pretty decent bargain available to the Vikings?
You said pretty much as a pass rusher?
Yeah, and in the 4th round, probably, I don't know if it actually excludes the Northwestern guy. Maybe it doesn't. But probably excludes the Florida guy, Gervon Dexter. Is it Gervon?
Yeah, Gervon, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It almost certainly excludes the Wisconsin guy, Keanu Benton. Obviously the noses like Siaki Ika and Mozzie Smith, I guess you call the nose, he's a pass rusher too. But when you get rid of those guys, what are the pass rushing tackles that are kind of available?
Yeah, so one of my pound the table guys this year is Byron Young out of Alabama. I shouldn't say he's the other Byron Young, the defensive tackle. He's not overly explosive. He's not overly athletic, but he's sturdy. He's refined. Like he's just a very high floor player at Alabama. He's got heavy hands. I think he 2-gaps well in the run game. But he did have some 5-tech reps as well in Alabama and showed the ability to win out wide a little bit. So I like Byron Young. He's really good with his hands, man. Like really good with his hands. So I really like Byron Young. But when we get into more of those at the like situational pass rushing defensive tackles, I like Moro Ojimo out of Texas. Not the plug, Coburn's the plug, but Ojimo is the more slippery guy. He's long. I think he's flexible. He's twitchy. So he's got the ability to do some nice things in pass rush situations. But Zach Pickens is decent all around as well. He can do some things in the passing game as well. But overall, it's kind of once you get past Gervon Dexter, Byron Young, it's like okay. These guys are a dime a dozen, it's it gets a little rough at that point.
All right. Yeah. And then, the Vikings are probably not going to go in the direction of safety, right? They got a 1st-round safety last year, couldn't see the field because of injury, but Harrison Smith is probably nearing the end of his time with the Vikings. Cameron Bynum, I don't know if he's going to be somebody that the Vikings like a lot. Mike Zimmer liked him a lot, made him a starter, but this new regime did not seem to think that he was, starter worthy when they drafted Lewis Cine. If they drafted a safety kind of in that same range we just talked about for that defensive tackle group, I had some trouble with it just on the Minnesota football party. I struggled to find a safety. And at one point I was like, I don't know, maybe I could convert a corner here to safety because we had an all defense draft and I was picking safety last. And so it was tough to find these guys because the athleticism of the middle chunk of this group, Christopher Smith.
It's bad.
Yeah. And Sidney Brown was already gone. So I was like, Jamie Robinson, I don't know. What does the middle of this group look like to you? Can you extract something that's like really exciting? I know some people like Jortavius Martin. I know some people want to convert some of these corners. JL Skinner, I ended up picking as my guy in that draft as like my final defensive player to pick. Sidney Brown, like what does that middle group look like to you that could actually be kind of maybe fight their way into being a starter instead of just being a special team or a rotational guy?
Yeah, if we're talking about a guy to potentially replace Harrison Smith, I think Quan Martin would be the guy I'd go with. Jartavius Martin would be the guy that I go with. And he played predominantly nickel this season, but man, he was really good. He would rotate back every once in a while. He runs the alley really well when he is playing at depth. He's got a nice range. Again, he tested off the charts as well. So and talking about that middle group not being athletic, he kind of stood out in that regard. I actually have Quan Martin rated higher than Antonio Johnson as my second safety.
Oh wow!
Okay. I think he's good, man. I think
really high.
I think he's the better Illinois safety as well. I struggle with Sidney Brown. I know some people really love Sidney Brown, but like he played 90% in the box and he missed 30 tackles the past 2 seasons. Like he's an undersized linebacker. Like I don't really know what to do with that. So I would say Quan Martin would be my guy there. I also really love Jamie Robinson because of his versatility. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at a Harrison Smith replacement, like you want a guy who is a safety and not a guy who's like going to be in the nickel over here in the box here. Like that just feels a little bit too anxious for me. Like that invokes anxiety for me when I try to be like, oh yeah, the Jamie Robinson can replace Harrison Smith. But I would say Quan Martin. Again, we can talk about JL Skinner, but JL Skinner played predominantly in the box, and when he did go out in space, man, it was kind of ugly when he was kind of playing in space. So again, Ronnie Hickman is. I like his eyes. I think his instincts and leadership are good, but like that dude's not an athlete either, and he hasn't tested at all. Like hasn't done anything pre-draft. So it gets pretty messy. So I would pretty much go all in if we're talking middle rounds on Quan Martin.
All right. You mentioned you like this guy's eyes. It made me think about all this recent conversation about the S2 test, which I've said my piece on that. Minnesota Football Party. I might end up saying my piece on that on this podcast, but I kind of want your view on it because it just kind of blew up, right? Like I think there was one mention of it on The Athletic in February, and then like a week ago, Daniel Jeremiah mentions it on a podcast, and everyone's talking about this S2 test for visual cognitive processing. We've seen some scores leak out. I don't know that we really have a context to evaluate if those scores are meaningful, but I mean, what's your take?
Yeah, I don't care about it right now. Like, talk to me in maybe 5 years when we have a little bit of a larger sample size. But like, there's just, I think, especially this time of year, there's so many things that people use to leverage. Well, this is why this quarterback's better than this guy. Like, I don't know. It doesn't move me. It doesn't move me. Like, because people like this is how the Wonderlic was in like the mid in 2010, 2011, 2012. People were like, "Oh, the Wonderlic." And then now we're like, well, the Wonderlic is obsolete. Nobody talks about it. It's not useful. So I have a hard time buying into S2 right now. But again, talk to me in 5 years if it's like we can see consistent results. But again, I think the 2021 class was the first class that took it. So like, I can't do a whole lot with that, especially when the 2022 class was just a bunch of bad quarterbacks. So like that washes a whole year out of my sample size. So it's like, I'm not there where I'm really utilizing it or like putting any stock into it yet.
All right, fair enough. And then we brought up a bunch of players that qualify here. So try to think of somebody that you haven't talked about yet that is from the perspective of no one's talking about this guy is your favorite player in the class.
Oh man, that's a good one. Nobody's talking about this guy. I could go, if we go tight end, like Brenton Strange out of Penn State. He's a top 100 player for me.
There's been a lot of talk about tight ends. Not a
Brenton
ton.
Strange.
Yeah, what's up with Brenton Strange?
So he can move all over. He plays in the slot. He plays in the H. He plays at the Y in line. He can move all over. Really strong hands. Again, wasn't asked to run a very diverse route tree, and he's not afraid to block either. So like, he's a well-rounded tight end. That's a pretty decent athlete in space. Like he's hurdled some dudes in space. So just a pretty solid all-around tight end in a pretty good tight end class. Like I remember Daniel Jeremiah around the combine was like, oh yeah, 8 of these guys might go top 75 or whatever, the top 3 rounds or whatever, top 2 rounds. And I was like, that's a little steep. And I still think that's a little steep. Like I think Luke Musgrave is probably pretty overrated for what I think he is as a player. But like Brenton Strange is just rock solid. Like there might not be a trait that like really pops. It's like, oh yeah, he does this one thing extremely well, but like there's no deficiencies in his game. I don't see a deficiency in his tape. So,
I mean, isn't that
I would say
we've been
Strange
talking about Michael Mayer, right? Like he doesn't have a trump card, but he does everything, right?
Like I think Michael Mayer has a trump card though. Like for one, he plays in the slot quite a bit and he wins in the slot, but like I think that guy sinks his hips really well for as big as he is. Like, I think that guy runs pretty good routes. And so I think he's far and away tight end one in this class. I know people like love Dalton Kincaid and Darnell Washington, but I think Mayer's just really solid and he's really good. And again, for how big and kind of thick with 2 C's that he is, like I think he sinks his hips pretty well when he's running around. So that's going to translate.
All right. Hey, man, are there any other thoughts you wanted to add that you were planning on bringing into the show and I just didn't ask the right questions to bring them up? And yeah, spit them out here.
Yeah, boy, we talked about a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think so, man. That was pretty comprehensive.
Dope. Fantastic.
That was pretty comprehensive.
All right, then we'll close it out here. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so Real Corey Kinnan on Twitter. I have a draft Substack. That's kind of where I house my draft content right now. I host a draft podcast with Devin Jackson called the Daft on Draft Podcast. My Substack is Daft on Draft. But again, I'm the editing, the editor for Browns Wire through USA Today. So those are the main places to kind of check out my stuff.
Yeah, when you have a draft guide, right?
I do. I just released it today. So
yeah.
I wrote up 171
I gave you the plug. You didn't even bring it up.
I didn't even. I spaced. I've been staying at like the past 2 week late nights trying to get this thing ready. So that just kind of spaced on me. But yes, I did release a draft guide today. $10. Again, it's password protected PDF. So all you have to do is Venmo me $10. I'll give you the password. It's very, very secure. But yeah, 171 players I got to this year. I kind of skimped out on quarterbacks because outside of Jake Haener, I was like, I don't want to watch these guys.
Wait, so you like Jake Haener?
I do like Jake Haener.
That's Thor's guy too. All right.
I think he's just got some stones on him. Like he's got some stones, and I can appreciate that. But yeah, so it's out there. It's pretty lengthy. I'm pretty proud of it. It's the second one I've done. Second year in a row, I've done about 170 each year. So yeah, I'm gonna catch up on my sleep now and probably just play video games until the draft and just recover. So,
all right, man, you do that. Thanks for doing this.
All right, let's go to the mailbag. And the first question is from Fred. Fred asks, given what we know about the low success rate among players drafted well above their consensus ranking, what player would be the biggest reach for the Vikings at 23 that you would not be mad at?
I think a lot of people already know the answer to this, given that I've recently been talking this player up a lot. But as of right now, the industry consensus on cornerback from Maryland, Deonte Banks, is, I want to say it's 34th. I can just take a quick look at that. It is 34th exactly. Of course, I know that. And so 23, that would be a pretty big reach. I think he's a really phenomenal player. And we'll see if Deonte Banks moves up or down the board as I complete the consensus process. So who knows? But that's one of them at 23 that I'd be pretty excited about. Between 24 and 34, there's not many other players I can say that for. Jahmyr Gibbs, no. Dalton Kincaid, no. Cam Smith, maybe. That's a 26, so I wouldn't really consider that a huge reach. Kelee Ringo, I wouldn't be, overjoyed about. You can listen to the interviews about that. Osiris Torres wouldn't make sense. Trenton Simpson, Drew Sanders, both of those I think would be pretty bad picks there. Zay Flowers at 31 could be another one of those players. Hopefully the Vikings would find a way to grab a second-round pick in order to kind of really build a good secondary if they decide to invest in a receiver first. And then I could see Elijah Cansey too, and Darnell Washington. So 31, 32, 33, 34 in the most recent consensus rankings all include players where I get it, where I wouldn't be mad. In fact, I would be kind of happy if they got, these players. I think Cansey is a little bit overrated by fans at this point, but that doesn't mean he should be ranked 32nd overall. I think that he's a good player. So, yeah, I think those are probably it. If I go past 34, there's not a ton. Not either of the tackles, although I think Darnell Wright is underrated at 36. It's just the Vikings don't need a tackle. So Anton Harrison, Darnell Wright at 35, 36. Jalen Hyatt wouldn't love it at 37. Manuel Forbes wouldn't love it at 38. Luke Musgrave wouldn't love it at 39. Josh Downs wouldn't love it at 40. So I think it's just that four at 31, 32, 33, 34.
All right, next question is going to be from Nick Howard, who asks, if Young or Stroud get by Houston at 2 and you're Kwesi, A, do you call the Cards, and B, what would you offer the Cards?
Okay, that one's pretty interesting. I don't know that the Vikings have the ability to trade up for that. So if we use the historical Rich Hill trading chart, which is based off of the history of trades that have occurred in the NFL, not the theoretical Jimmy Johnson chart, but one that was built off of the actual trades that have happened. Um, the Arizona Cardinals have like 514 points of value with that third overall pick. So the Vikings at pick 23 have 245. So you have to do that. Plus you have to do pick 87, which is 48 points. Plus you have to do pick 119, which is 24 points. We have just crossed 300. We're at 317. We need 200 more. The Vikings do not have that. They have 2 more picks. One's worth 10 points. One is worth 3 points. You could, in theory, trade Dalvin Cook. Let's say Dalvin Cook is worth a 4th round pick. So we add the 10, we add the 3, and we add Dalvin Cook, which is, 24, 25. You still would be 150, 160 short. Maybe you trade Za'Darius Smith. That could be worth the 3rd round pick, right? So maybe that's worth 50. You're still, 100 short. I don't think you're going to get there, especially because we didn't apply the quarterback tax. When teams trade up for a quarterback, they pay more. So, no, you could trade every pick in the draft plus 2 players that are in theory on the trading block at fairly generous prices. You still would not be able to trade up to 3. But, explore it, I guess. I don't know if I'd trade a whole draft class for it. I guess you could trade like next year's first, which would probably be worth like 150 points. That puts you over the edge. But you're trading like first this year, first next year, all your picks from this year, and 2 players. I don't do that.
That's a bit more of a mortgage than you should be able to handle.
Yeah.
Also from Nick Howard, who is your favorite Vikings draft bust?
Favorite Vikings draft bust? Does Cordero Patterson count? I think he does.
If he was brought in to be a wide receiver. He wasn't brought in to be one of the greatest kick returners of all time.
Right. Like I think if you use your 1st round pick on a player that turns out to be the best kick returner in history, yeah, you probably screwed up. Like that, it's such a weird thing to say. Yeah, he's the greatest player to ever do this. Yeah, but he's not worth it.
But he was absolutely a bust.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm fond of Laquan Treadwell more as a result of like Stockholm syndrome than anything else over the past year from last summer.
That's just the experience of the Roger Goodell Laquan Treadwell shadow box
right into my soul for months.
You've been scarred by it, and I think that's why you kind of produce this. I will say, like, the Trey Waynes one made me feel very correct about my tanks. I like being confident, as you could tell. So it was nice to be right about a player. But I think in terms of like the player that I like the most, it's got to be, because I thought Matt Khalil was good. Obviously, that didn't turn out. It's got to be Cordero Patterson, right? Like, I don't think anyone liked the Christian Ponder or Matt Khalil busts. I think hard for a lot of people to dislike the Cordero Patterson bust. Like, yeah, maybe you should have picked a good receiver, but like, yeah, look what you got.
That's funny. Like, well, it might have to be Cordero Patterson, and that's what's weird about it. Lake Cavassier asks, which prospect are you rooting for the Vikings to take this year? Purely on awesomeness of their name, and why is it Penn State center Juice Scruggs?
Okay, yeah, Juice Scruggs is there's like a pretty decent all name group this year. I haven't gone like entirely through it, but it's not as good as it has been some other years. But like, there are some good names. I like Zay Flowers. That's a pretty good name. I like John Michael Schmitz. That's a pretty good name. Let's see. Let's take a look at some of these other ones. Ozzie Smith is okay as a name. Let's take a look. Sam Laporta, I kind of like that. I don't think a lot of people see that name and think it's awesome, but I just kind of like that one. Not Tommy Adebaware. This player is not very good, Keishon Butte, but that's like a pretty fun name to work with. Tank Dell is a pretty fun name to work with. DeMarvion Overshown is a great name to work with. Kind of going down this list a little bit more. Yeah, it's like there's like some pretty good ones. Israel Abanaconda from Pitt, pretty good. Roshan Johnson, Dontavion Wicks. Dontavion Wicks is like a good one that like, rolls off the tongue pretty well. It sounds really nice. Let's see what we got. Yeah, I mean, there's like some pretty decent ones, but they're all like pretty late guys. So yeah, I think that. Habakkuk Baldonado. That's a great one. There's that guy. He's an edge rusher from Pitt.
That is pretty good.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty strong.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with that one.
5 a.m. tweeter, Arif, how do you think the consensus big board will perform this year?
Pretty good. I don't know. Like, it's probably not going to do a great job with quarterbacks, but it never does. These quarterbacks in particular are like spread across the consensus board, so we could see 4 quarterbacks go in the top 10, as I mentioned to both guests. The 4th quarterback is ranked 16th, and because the process by which I grade the consensus board or grade teams against the consensus board, it does take into account positional value, but the difference between like number 1 and number 16 is enormous, greater than the difference between number 16 and number 32, right? Probably greater than the difference between 16 and 42, right? So the point values are going to be pretty off, even if it adjusts for, quarterback value and team need and stuff like that. So I will say it's probably not going to do great this year just because of the quarterbacks. But other than that, and maybe Bijan at 5, that one's going to be pretty tough to deal with. But other than that, I think it's probably going to do a pretty good job, especially once we get all the forecaster boards in.
Well, let's go to Anya Taylor-Joy. It's still fantastic.
I love it. I love that.
Who asks, since Green Bay and the Jets can't seem to make out a deal, should the Vikings try to trade Cousins to the Jets for picks in a dual effort to move on from Cousins and to screw over the Packers?
Yes. Yeah, sure. That sounds funny.
Like, it seems like a no-brainer at that point.
Right. Like, call him during the draft, like, hey, I know you're in a tough spot, but do I have the deal for you?
Is that really? That's where that's where you went with that?
Yeah.
I'm almost embarrassed.
And now you've got enough ammo to move up for a quarterback.
Almost embarrassed. Ruben Frost asks, when comparing how teams value players, does the difference more come from evaluation, how good the player is, or evaluation, how much they value that player's skill set / style?
So, like, in comparing how teams value players compared to other teams, I think the primary factor is that evaluation, how good the player is. I think that matters more. Like, fundamentally, teams will generally, it matters more in terms of like the total, like, let's say contract value or draft slot. So that is going to kind of drive things more than the particulars of, the skill set or the role that they fit within that talent level. But the differences between teams, so that I think drives overall value, what the contract is, what the draft slot is, whatever. But the differences between teams, if they have big differences on players, they typically do not disagree on how good a player is, but rather how useful that player is for them, at least in my experience. So a great example is this wide receiver class. You've heard us talk about kind of how there's a lot of slot types. Zay Flowers is probably the top receiver among this group of slot style receivers that has a bunch of speed, right? Your Jalen Hyatt and Xavier Hutchinson and your Josh Downs and so on, right? And I think teams probably think that he's the best, but teams will disagree on which players are going to be slot only and which ones are outside capable. And so if they happen to agree with Thor that Zay Flowers is outside capable, they will probably value him higher. But if they don't agree with Thor and think that he's a slot only guy, but do think that, for example, Josh Downs is an outside player, then they might agree that Zay Flowers is probably a better player overall, and they might both value Zay Flowers as a higher pick, but Josh Downs is going to end up higher on that second board in that example. So I think evaluation is going to drive most of the value, and the differences will come primarily in that role, the skill set style thing that you identified.
Ben asks, which positions on the field have the best chance to move from the USFL/XFL to the NFL successfully? Success as in contribute on more than just special teams. Or are we more likely to see coaching success come from the alternate leagues more than we are to see player success?
I mean, I think you're more likely to see coaching success because there aren't as many barriers, I think, between the two. Like, I would say that in order for a player to be successful in the NFL, you need to be physically capable, mentally capable, and emotionally capable, right? You need to be able to do a bunch of hard work. You need to, run as fast as you need to do and be as strong as you need to be. And then you also need to be able to process the field very well, right? think as a coach, you basically only need those last two things. You don't need to be physically capable in the same way, and so there's fewer barriers. And then also, a lot of times those coaches were in the NFL at some point, and so there's already kind of a crossover in a bigger way than it is for these USFL players, especially because the coaches aren't considered not NFL capable anymore unless it's somebody like Steve Spurrier with the AAF, right? And then you're just like, yeah, I mean, his stuff just doesn't work in the NFL, and he's married to his stuff, and so he's not going to really change that. And he dominates the AAF, so he's pretty comfortable with that. So yeah, so I think it's coaches, but if I'm just going to restrict it to like on-field positions, I think that, like in theory, you would see running back, right? Given what we have, kind of found in the analytics community about, the fungibility of running backs at like a broad level. And that probably I should trust that. But, looking at a lot of these positions and how, teams have tried to cultivate those players in the NFL and how they've done, it very much seems like it's actually the skill positions, the wide receivers and the cornerbacks, that most likely have that shot. I think that that's just a sign of the amount of depth that the NFL has at those positions. And I recently wrote a piece about, the possibility of NFL expansion into Europe. And I mentioned that, one of the reasons this is probably a bad idea is that there's not enough offensive line talent, there's not enough quarterback talent, and there may not be enough like defensive line talent. But those prior two are the most important. But and the USFL is a really great, or the XFL, they're both really great kind of proxies for that. I mean, it doesn't really tell you much because what you're really learning is, what you're really leaning on is the quality of those backups, not the quality of like the XFL type players who are all, optimistically practice squad players. But it's a good proxy. And I think that the fact that receivers seem to have that capability might be, the answer to that question. So that receivers and cornerbacks are probably the most likely to do it, because the receivers that excel in the XFL, AAF, USFL, and cornerbacks that excel, fundamentally they will have the baseline physical talent that you need. And so that knocks out one of those three. You just have to concern yourself with the other two. And it may just be hard to make camp as a receiver or a corner because of the amount of talent at the NFL. And so like some legitimately good receivers might fall through the cracks. So I think that's the answer.
Next question is going to be from Jack, who asks, what are the odds that we just keep Za'Darius? Would it be excessive to run Hunter, Davenport, and Z together beyond just a rotation? With positional fluidity of the new defensive scheme, they're not shackled to the old outside linebacker defensive end roles. Is the benefit of having all three worth the price of them all?
It's probably worth it. And I think that it would, like, ideally they would play, in a 1,100 snap season, they would all play 850 snaps or something like that. And so that's 2,200 edge snaps to go around. Anybody who's good at math will know that, like I said, at least 2,500 snaps. So there's going to be some moments where all three are on the field at the same time in order for that to work out. And I think that that's fine. The Vikings currently, and maybe that changes the draft, don't really have a pass rushing defensive tackle. And they can deploy Za'Darius Smith up the middle because he's very good at that. But also Marcus Davenport, depending on the way the Vikings are kind of handling, his weight goals and stuff like that, might want to push him inside on a couple of plays. So you could see all three of them on the field at once, especially on passing down. So I don't think it's the worst idea in the world. In fact, I do think they would be worth it. The issue is just like, can the Vikings take the void hit for Za'Darius next year? Can they take the void hit on top of that with Marcus Davenport? Can they? Because they're not going to be able to keep Smith, and they're going to have to rework a Marcus Davenport deal if he turns out. That's really the issue. I think that it would make sense, but I think probably ideally you would trade him. But there's a world where you keep him and you're probably in a good spot.
Euleron is asking the question we're all thinking. With the number 0 now available for jersey numbers, is it finally time to retire 84?
I think you probably want one or two more jerseys to open up. I mean, the Vikings kind of run up against it every year in camp when it comes to jersey numbers. So you probably need one or two more new jerseys.
-1, -2 comes in there, and maybe -3. Then we can talk.
Well, I mean, the NBA has a 0 and a 00, right? So
all things are possible at this point.
Right.
Nolan Kaler asks, for the NordVPN code, which player would be the best at giving someone else privacy and anonymity? Which player is most in need of security and peace of mind?
Oh boy. Well, I think that the one that demands peace of mind more than anyone else is Kirk Cousins. I mean, he literally hires a brain scientist to monitor whether or not his mind is at peace at any given moment. So that's the need. As for somebody who can provide privacy and anonymity, for this segue to a sponsor we don't have.
It was on the short list of potential ones to.
It really was
to do this year, but
I guess probably like Harrison Smith, right? Shuts down, pesky interlopers, prevents,
with
people from getting past your protection. Right. So with Prince images. I feel like, Harrison Smith can secure your stuff and relatively anonymous for a star player, right? So
yeah,
I'd say him.
Let's go to ET Spaceman, who asks, for Reef's Cooking Corner, what is the best and worst part of the chicken? If you were drafting a team of foods, what parts of the chicken would make the most sense on a rookie contract? And how about a second or a third contract?
That's a crazy question. If I'm going to take it seriously, which I mean, like, why not? It's a mailbag. The problem is I don't know what qualifies as parts of a chicken, right? Because you buy a whole chicken in a store, half the time you're not going to get like the gizzards in the neck and the organ meat that comes with it. Half the time you are. You're never going to get the head. You're never going to get the feet. But sometimes you do. Does that count as a part of the chicken that's best or worst? I don't know. Do the wings count? Okay, what about the individual drumettes versus the flats versus the wing tips? Because the wing tips are kind of a fun snack, but also probably just better for stock. So this is an expansive thing to kind of weigh in on. I'm going to say that like we'll exclude kind of the stuff that is less common in Western grocery stores, which means we're going to exclude the head, we're going to exclude the feet, and obviously like the feathers, which I didn't even bring up earlier. But yeah, let's get rid of that stuff. We're gonna say that the neck kind of doesn't count, the organ meat kind of doesn't count. I only use them to make stock anyway. So we're left with chicken breast, chicken thigh, the leg, and the wing. Right? I would argue that, unless I missed something, James, I would argue that the thigh is actually the best part. The thigh is phenomenal. The leg is great. I love the leg. Long live the leg. But the thigh cooks so evenly, and it stands up to so much heat, and it's so much harder to screw up, and it tastes better when cooked perfectly than the breast. The leg just has the one issue with the bone running through it, and it's easier for it to heat up a little bit too much, a little bit easier for it to be a little bit too tough. The thigh is just much more likely to remain tender throughout the cooking process if you're a bad cook, if you're a medium cook, or if you're a good cook. So the thigh actually, I think, is up there. I know that a bunch of people want to say wings. I totally get it. Totally understand. Wings are phenomenal. I don't want to begrudge you that. But personally, I like a fried chicken. If I'm getting like a fried chicken, like an 8-box, I'm going for the thigh first. Then I'm probably going for a drummy. I know most people go for the drummy first. Totally get it again. And then I'm going for the wings. The wings are great. And I'm glad that this part of the chicken that used to actually just be discarded is now like a staple of snack cuisine. So these are all very close to me. I would argue, though, that the breast is it is the worst, but I think it gets shortchanged a lot because I think if you're a pretty good cook, you can cook like a really delicious chicken breast. So I think it's fine. And in some applications, like butter chicken, I prefer the breast over the thighs. So we're just talking generally, but there are applications where the breast is a little bit better just because it is a leaner meat, because it will take on more of the flavor around it. But generally speaking, the thigh is my 1-1. Situationally, I may change. If I'm preparing for like a Super Bowl, I'm going wings. I don't want to take these giant pieces like the legs. And if I'm like cutting something up for inside like a rice dish, I might prefer the breast. So it really all depends. But I think they're just, for most applications, I'll go with the chicken thigh.
Let's go to our next question, and that comes from Logan Bolsharif, who asks, for James and Arif's Discord leakage corner. Yesterday, the Washington Post released a story about somebody releasing classified U.S. government documents to friends on a Discord server. What classified information is most likely to be released within Norse Code, or Norse Code, rather, the thing we call the Discord?
Yeah.
And who would be the leaker, James, Arif, or Dusty?
100% Dusty. Not even close.
Yeah, it's going to be Dusty. Yeah.
That's just Dusty. As for what the information would be, architectural plans for famous historical buildings from New York.
It's an option? I was thinking unreleased episodes that he just managed to like get out of his computer.
Away. Yeah.
I was messing with this and I managed to get back the episode that we lost when we did for the Josh Freeman episode. So like that sort of thing.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I could see that. I could see, secret recipes, right? The recipe to Coke, the recipe to KFC, which I think that one's actually public now, but some of the secret recipes for, all of the crazy secret recipes that people do for barbecue, just releasing a bunch of those. I could see a bunch of those too. Also, I love the idea that someone would leak classified information to win an argument. Which is what happens on Warzone, and I assume what happened in this Discord server. That's amazing.
From Minneapolis Cinnamon Cheerios, for Arif's career change corner, I've often wondered about the possibility of lying on my resume by saying I had years of experience working for companies that were no longer in business. I figured if the company no longer exists, no one would be there to answer any questions from prospective employers regarding my work history there. But could this also work for companies that were technically still in business, but are so dysfunctional that there is no HR department or department managers, to foil my plans? Instead of listing my lame current job and career field on my resume, what would be the pros and cons of saying that I was a former mid-level account manager at Twitter who left when Elon took over? What are they going to do? Tweet at Elon to ask about my work history?
I think I saw a tweet that basically said you should do this.
You probably saw the same thing.
No, it was a TikTok. I saw a TikTok that said you should do this.
Yeah, it was a TikTok because they were describing it as, was it Office Max or was it like...
Yeah. The grift was that they would do it with Office Max, then they'd have their friends like pretend to be their managers, and so they'd list them as references and stuff like that. Which,
yeah, because that had gone out of business, and it was basically like a lesser version of it was the red version of Best Buy.
Yeah, exactly. And so you could apply for whatever you want, say that was your work history, then they wouldn't be able to check. That was a piece of advice that guy gave, which we don't endorse.
Like there's a lot of careful moment there.
Yeah, I just, the last time I made a statement about what we categorically do or do not endorse in the show unilaterally without your input, we got a lot of pushback because I think it was the epigenetics one, right?
Well, there was that, and then there was also the one where we were discussing I'm thinking about the time that you told Don from Ohio it was okay to lie to his wife.
Oh, okay. That was not like a show endorses the thing. That was, I immediately regret the words that I just said. Thing.
Yeah, let's go with that.
But the thing with the epigenetics one is that I said categorically, we do not believe in epigenetics, and a bunch of scientists with like degrees and experience and stuff. Like Arif, I'm really surprised. I work in epigenetics, and it's like, and I was like, look, guys, you're probably, that's fine. You're right. It's true. But the way people talk about epigenetics in the public conversation is not true. And they were like, yeah, okay, I guess, but like, please don't do that again. And here I am doing it again. Do not lie on your resume in a way that is impossible to catch and completely unaccountable. That would be, in most ethical systems that are fairly mainstream at the moment, pretty unethical. If we're living in maybe a different world, or if you're working towards a different ethical system that you believe is a better world, your plans might be a little bit different in regards to this kind of question, but I would argue that I wouldn't want to be caught encouraging illegal activity, and this is fraud, right? That's got to be illegal. So, don't do this very interesting, easy thing.
Yes, that. Definitely don't do the thing that we're going to post the link to in the show notes.
Yeah.
you might have to dig that one up. Ingram's Left Foot asks, what type of celebration should the NFL as a whole have for Dan Snyder leaving their ranks? Viking funeral, like Irish wake?
A Viking funeral is like a sign of honor for a warrior.
Yeah, that's definitely not happening. I think an Irish goodbye is better. Like everyone just leaves. Like, yeah, we're leaving. We're not saying a thing. We're done.
Yeah, I think, Viking stuff, you don't want that. The sooner we can forget the Dan Snyder. Actually, we would probably, like, as an abject lesson in, like, the excess allowed by the NFL, it's important to remember the Dan Snyder era. But, like, the faster we can get rid of the guy, the better. Let's not do any funerals.
Yeah, that's there's a scar here that it's not just going to go away.
Did it come from like a falling piece at the stadium? Or?
Yeah, that, yes. The poop water, yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad there's another stadium that we can make fun of for falling apart.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Brian Jellerson asks, combining Arif's baby corner and James's relationship corner, always two fine tastes that taste great together.
No. Oh, God.
My wife and I are expecting our first child any day now. Congrats. How do I convince my wife that our Norse code baby onesie, thank you, Kevin Jellerson, is the only correct option for our son's homecoming outfit?
Is that what it's called? For like when you take it home.
Yeah, when you bring the child home.
It. I can't believe I said that. When you take it home. When you bring the object to your humble abode.
The object.
Yeah. When the object arrives at your residence. Do you need much convincing? I don't know. It feels like it makes the argument itself. Do you have the onesie?
I was gonna say he has the onesie. Like she has to see it and be like, "Oh no, I totally get it." Yeah.
So frankly, if you show it to her and she says no, that's a whole different set of that's more relationship corner stuff than baby corner stuff.
Yeah, that's you're gonna have to. I mean, what you could do is you could take pictures of it of the child. You could take pictures of the child before in it, put on the homecoming outfit, and then when you get home, put the child in the new Norse code onesie, and just go, okay, well, he may have gone home in the outfit that this was, but we have pictures all the while with the other one. So, what was the real homecoming outfit? The one that he spent the most time in, and you get to have that dumb argument with Kevin Jellerson, who proceeds to make fun of you. Right.
I think a fruitless philosophical argument is well within the spirit of the show, and therefore worthy of the onesie.
Yes, that is just in keeping with like show history.
Yeah.
R. Menson asks our final question of the episode for the podcasting etiquette corner. Every episode, James asks Arif what he has to plug, but Arif never returns the favor, even though Arif's plugs have helped make him a big-time national reporter. Why doesn't Arif provide the same courtesy to James? And what does James have to plug?
Hey, James, what do you have to plug? Where can people find you?
Well, you can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If I'm plugging anything right now, it's that the city of Crookston, Minnesota is going to have a festival that I'm in charge of. So that could be entertaining or terrifying, depending on your definition of the word. And the street dance for that is on August 19th. It's a band out of South Dakota.
Be sure to head there on August 19th. Tell the organizers there that James. Maybe you'll get some special perks.
You will not. You will still have to pay $5 to get into the thing. But events are happening that entire week. I'm only saying this also because I got up at like 7 a.m. to do a grant proposal this morning.
Ugh,
so I'm a little,
gross.
it was fine, but like, I got up at 5:30 to drive half an hour to go do that. So
Oh Jesus!
my time schedule's a bit loopy at the moment. So if I'm plugging anything, it's Crookston Oxcart Days, which exists from, let's see if I can remember this from memory and not from my phone. I'm gonna say the 14th of August through the 20th of August. Sure, let's go with that. Head out to Crookston, Minnesota, off of Highway 2 for a fun festival. That's what I have to plug. That is going to be the end of this episode. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Well, I've got the Consensus Big Board coming up. I just wrote a piece on Dan Snyder, and his legacy, I guess is the best way to put it.
That's in quotations.
Yeah, so you can read that very soon. I'll have a piece on the S2 test that everyone is writing about, and then I'll also have pieces about these quarterbacks that are coming out. I'll have some profiles on those quarterbacks. So hopefully those will be entertaining. I didn't write any pieces over the past week because I was busy doing like company stuff for the first half of the week down in Florida, and then personal stuff for the second half of the week up in Canada. Again, always, why is it Canada?
Well, because it is the home of poutine, and that has become your new love.
I did get more poutine.
You did,
actually,
didn't
yeah.
you?
Yeah.
Just
It's so good. It's so good.
you,
It's the one thing that and Bare Naked Ladies. Those are the things that also obviously Avril Lavigne rip, but that's what Canada has produced. And frankly, for a population of, was it 50 million? Not enough. They're not pulling their weight.
You don't have to go to Canada for poutine, but they're
okay.
worse
Well, I've
reasons.
had the poutine here, and it's great. And I've had the poutine in Canada, and it is phenomenal.
It's worth the mileage.
They have places called poutineries. Did you know that?
Yes, I do, because you told me about it months ago when you were stuck in Canada.
Right. Okay. So the sole business model is poutine. That's all they sell, and there's a reason it works, James. There's a reason it works.
Even the sushi places sell poutine. It's amazing.
Yeah, I don't recommend that one.
That one's not as good.
All the fast food places like A&W, which is really big up there, McDonald's, Popeyes, they all do poutine as well. Don't do it. Don't get it. It sucks. It's as if your only contact with like American burgers was like these really like phenomenal smash burgers made by people who like specialize in cooking burgers to order, or you've only ever had like Five Guys, and you go and you order like just a regular McDonald's cheeseburger. Like the difference is just like, oh my gosh. Now I love a regular McDonald's cheeseburger, but if that's all you had, right, is Five Guys, and you come to the United States or whatever, you come to a place that doesn't have it, you want a burger and you get McDonald's, you're kind of disappointed. You're like, this is a burger? Same thing with the poutine in the Popeyes. Don't get it. It sucks. They say Cajun gravy. Don't be tricked by how delicious that sounds. Just get poutine from the poutinery.
You have a very complicated relationship with Canadian poutine.
Look, if Canada was wiped off the map and I lost all my poutine, probably worth it. But because it hasn't been, I'm going to enjoy it.
And on that, I guess, metaphorical bombshell, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. We might be back before the draft. We will see you then. But for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that the Vikings are not to be trusted. And we'll be back here shortly. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of Pro Football Network, and he can be found at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a few different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merchandise. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
All things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.